You're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Matt Berkman. Our guest today is Femi Táíwò. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His theoretical work draws on the Black radical tradition, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, German transcendental philosophy, materialist thought, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. He recently finished writing a book entitled Reconstructing Reparations. It offers a novel philosophical argument for reparations and explores links with environmental justice. Today we're going to discuss a recent piece of his in Dissent magazine. Femi Táíwò, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, happy to be here.
So your recent article in Dissent magazine talks about the possibility of what you call climate apartheid. Can you tell us about what that term means?
Yeah, the term climate apartheid expresses the same idea as another idea that I've been talking about recently called climate colonialism. And more or less, they express the same idea at different scales. Neither of those terms, obviously, are terms that I came up with. They've been used for years and years by different people, different politics. But what they mean to me are an expression of the fact that our social systems and the forms of inequality that are fundamental to them and that help sustain them are increasingly going to wrap around and renegotiate themselves around climate crisis. In particular, the ability or lack thereof to insulate oneself from the worst effects of climate crisis will increasingly decide where in society you are and where in the social hierarchies you are, and vice versa.
So in the article, you offer some examples from recent history that suggest what the future of climate apartheid might look like. Can you go over some of those for the people listening?
Yeah, a lot of the examples in the article center around policing because, to me, in the way that I understand the world, policing is one of the institutions that is most centrally involved with the distribution of risk and vulnerability in society, which I think is a fundamental aspect of how societies protect themselves and how societies keep going in the form that they're in. So the fact that police protect property and thus the interests of property owners is not an accident. It's part and parcel of the social function of what that institution's for, right? And protecting the worst off from the effects of poverty, from violence, is less a central part of police's job description than perhaps, we might get the impression from media, from politicians, so on and so forth. So the examples in the piece in Dissent focus on a few things that could happen with policing. One is on the kind of street end of policing. So police can be used to secure particular neighborhoods from crime and make them habitable for people of higher class backgrounds and higher ability to pay higher rents. So the effects of gentrification are often visible in terms of police behavior. And then there's, of course, the other end of policing after arrest, which is incarceration. And one thing that we've already seen in the wildfires, for example, in California that happened last year, is the utilization of incarcerated people and that form of coerced labor to help protect property from the worst impacts of climate crisis, which were, in the case of California, the climate-fueled wildfires, which threatened to destroy homes in California.
You also mentioned Hurricane Katrina. That seemed like a very illustrative case. I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. Hurricane Katrina and in general, responses to natural disasters and other kinds of crisis moments in history, I think, provide real insight into what it is that our going institutions instinctively protect, what they exist to protect, and just as importantly, who they exist to protect. So, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, many people in New Orleans were forced to the Superdome by the impact of the flooding and the property destruction of the hurricane. People who were elsewhere were often on the streets trying to find food, trying to find medicine, trying to find needed supplies. And the media environment changed in ways that I think are indicative of the kinds of narratives and the kinds of mobilization of racial, class-based, and other forms of resentment that we can expect in the coming years as climate crisis accelerates. They demeaned certain people as looters, overwhelmingly Black people who were looking for supplies. And it wasn't just the media, but also people that lived in the area took it upon themselves to serve as vigilantes as well as law enforcement. And both of these groups of people had a kind of de facto authority to shoot and kill. So Black people who were out looking for supplies were shot with impunity in the response to Hurricane Katrina. And vigilante justice by predominantly white groups of people, and of course um, law enforcement organizations also targeted Black people with violence. Meanwhile, people who were incarcerated in New Orleans Parish were left in water up to their waists, including children, during this event. So property was protected. Supplies that would have been ruined by water were protected. But the people who lived in New Orleans were much less protected. And the extent to which they were less protected and even exposed to predatory violence had a lot to do with racial identity and racial discrimination.
In the article, you also touch on international migration, and we hear a lot about climate refugees in the media. Can you talk about how that fits into the picture that you're sketching out here?
Yeah, so ongoing trends right now in global politics include a toxic mix of what the natural world is doing, how our ecology is changing, and trends in the movements of capital, which is transnational, which doesn't need to respect borders in the ways that we try to force and corral people into respecting borders. And in the medium term to long term, over the next couple of decades and out to the remainder of the century, if we don't get our act together and do a course correction, we're on what strikes me as a very genocidal pathway. So a couple of things are converging. One was a flight of capital that was triggered by the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 into land holdings and resource holdings. Pension funds and corporations and countries are buying land in the global south. Different places and different organizations have different goals for this land. Some people see it purely as an investment vehicle. For some countries, it's about securing supply chains, especially countries that have low amounts of arable land within their borders. But what it amounts to is the control of large swaths of land and, importantly, water and other resources that may be in and around that land by people far away who are insulated from the political effects of the decisions made about how to manage that land. Southeast Asia was hit by this flood of capital. South America was hit by this flood of capital. But nowhere was hit harder than the African continent. By some estimates, up to a quarter of the arable land on the continent has been bought up by large-scale land acquisitions. And so this means that the food security of the continent is unlikely to be the decision maker for how arable land is used and maintained, and rather transnational profit imperatives and national security imperatives of countries that may be on the other side of the world are going to decide how that land is used. Now, compare that, sit that fact next to the ongoing desertification of the Sahel, which means that there's going to be less arable land on the continent, and the ongoing food security issues on the continent. There's already famine conditions in multiple countries on the continent under the current political and socioeconomic conditions. So we walk all of this out 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. We have problems. Africa is not the only place that is facing climate crisis fueled economic and political problems. Many of the people in Central America who have been displaced by issues with water availability, especially in Guatemala. And worldwide, outside of the so-called developing world or the third world or the global south, whatever we'd like to call it, richer nations, including the United States, including the EU, including Australia, are adopting hardline, xenophobic, anti-immigration stances in practice when not also in word. So in the United States, we have concentration camps along our southern border where climate refugees in the present tense are being warehoused. And all of this political energy that's pushing rightward on immigration is going to meet the political conditions that I just explained at the beginning in terms of what things are going to be driving displacement in the global south. And so unless we get our act together very quickly, we're going to be looking at displacement within borders, but also across borders, meeting increasingly militarized borders. And that's a recipe for genocide.
Is climate apartheid in any way distinct from the racialized class inequalities that exist in American and global capitalism kind of generally? Or is it just a specific manifestation of that broader pattern of inequality that's being heightened by ecological crisis?
Yeah, I think the second of those two options is more how I'm thinking of it. We're in fact looking at more or less the same kind of racialized class inequalities that we've had in American capitalism, and not just American capitalism, but in the global state system, that have decided which regions of the world and which populations within them have access to even the basic stuff of material security, food security, housing security, security from interpersonal violence. In much of the world, those are fairly starkly racialized. The United States is not an exception to that. And climate apartheid is going to intensify those inequalities in some cases redistribute them geographically, but it's going to be a manifestation that affords itself to the same basic political logic of political inequality as such under racial capitalism over the last 5 centuries.
A question that I had, reading your article, which, you touch upon the history of policing from the 17th century forward. And my question is really, why do governments and capital also tend to react to crises by policing their fallout, their effects, rather than mitigating their root causes, whether we're talking about climate change or economic crises that we keep having in the US, which one might think that mitigating the root causes of these catastrophic trends would be better in the long term for capital reproduction, capitalism reproducing itself, right? Having to deal with migrant flows that, as you suggest, might result in genocidal activity is certainly going to disrupt the workings of capitalism. So what is it that makes governments turn to coercive containment measures rather than trying to get to the root causes?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, I think. And I think one of the things it might provoke us to do is reconsider what we take to be both the root causes of climate change, but also the kind of root basic fundamental values of capitalism, or as I would say, racial capitalism, as a political structure. The explanation that occurs to me for why it is that governments in the US and elsewhere react to crises by policing their effects rather than mitigating their root causes goes by way of telling a slightly different story about what the kind of focal values are for capitalism as a system. And this is the particular way that I understand racial capitalism. There's profit, right? There's the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of surplus value, right? Those kind of reliable economic formulations of what it is that the people at the top of the system are trying to do. And you can get very far in explaining a lot of history of the US or elsewhere by appeal to that drive. We want more money, so on and so forth. But I think a precondition for profit maximization, for the endless accumulation of wealth, is what I've been calling security, right? So the idea is not just that I want high returns for my capital, but I want to be sure that this system against which I'm taking all of my business actions, right? I want to know that these roads are still going to be here. I want to know that I'm still going to have control of my company. I want to know that I'm still going to be able to make stable predictions about what other people are going to do and about what the various possibilities for rates of return on my capital could be, right? These kind of stability questions and what's required by other parts of the institutions to make those things stable, that's security, right? And it's hard to subsume that question in what you mean by profit. I mean, people can try, and some strategies are better than others, but at the bottom line is you need to not just have a workforce, but you need to make sure that they're not going to rise up against you. And what you need for that isn't another deal with some other set of capitalists, or what you need for that isn't just bonds to stabilize your portfolio. You need cops to break up picket lines, right? You need surveillance of labor organizers. You need to defeat the Soviet Union so that this whole capitalism thing in general keeps going. Those are security imperatives, which aren't in and of themselves profitable, but make profit possible. And if you look at the way that racial capitalism has secured itself over the centuries, it's been primarily in the default disantagonistic mode, right? Every example I just gave was surveilling and or terrorizing and or killing one set of people to protect the profit interests and other interests, other hierarchical interests, white supremacist interests, patriarchal interests of the people at the top of the system. And I think that approach to securing the system is built into the kind of social structure that we have. And that's something that comes out of the racial capitalism analysis that's maybe different than other ways of thinking about capitalism.
At the end of your article, you kind of talk about what we need to do in the face of pending climate apartheid. And you kind of argue that the victims of climate apartheid, the potential victims, need to learn how to or figure out an effective way to assert their power over the coercive apparatus of states. And my question is, how on a practical level can that be done? And what are the major obstacles that have to be overcome for that to happen?
So here it might be better to start with the obstacles, right? We all know some of them, right? The most obvious obstacle is just that the police are an armed, extremely violent institution, and their violence has effectively been sanctioned by the other institutions whose specific job it is to curb their violence, right? So whether we're talking about the executive branch command structure at the city level, at the state level, at the federal level, or whether we're talking about prosecutors whose job it is to indict people for crimes and so on and so forth. Wherever you look at checks and balances of police as an institution, you will find complicity, you will find blank checks. So between the police's own coercive power and the kind of tacit borrowed power from the institutions that are supposed to rein them in, we have a massive institutional obstacle in the shape of really the state itself in a way that is seldom true of policy initiatives, right? The state is a very large, especially in the United States, the state is a very large institution, and it has lots of parts, and lots of those other parts are at odds with other parts from time to time. There's something about the police, I think, their role in providing security for the entire structure, but whatever it is, there's something about the police that just gets the state, gets both of the parties, gets all of those little constituent institutions of state power in line behind the Billy Club. And so I think it's a tall order to do anything serious about policing, right? But, the largest demonstration or series of demonstrations in US history last summer made it seem to me like this is still within the realm of possibility. This is still something that can be done, even though the obstacles are so serious. To me, I like a lot of the campaign demands that are coming out of the opposition to police violence. I think defunding is a smart solution, right? It expresses in terms that the institution can understand and that are in no way uncertain. Opposition to the current system and material ways of making police as an institution weaker than they are. I think that's smart. I think I think of myself as an abolitionist. That's, in a better world, there wouldn't be police of this sort. But I think what it comes down to, I think a good practical way forward in terms of thinking about policing as an institution is a particular radical perspective that was advanced by the Black Panther Party in the late 60s and early 70s, called community control over police. And that idea is basically just to say, look, as a lot of the transformative justice people talk about, and as they're doing in the work that they do, we understand that there are safety needs that people have, especially marginalized people, right? And something has to meet those needs. But the police department certainly is not the thing that is going to do that, right? The police department is protecting property, it's protecting this corrupt system. But it's protecting that corrupt system because of who is in charge, right? So if we were to enact some other vision of public safety, we would need the resources to see it through. And so I think the goal that makes sense from that way of looking at the issue is to get community control over the resources that police now have. And one way that that can look like is a victory that was recently won by organizers in Seattle. So they won a $30 million cut to the police budget. So that's a victory from a defund perspective. But they won something that, to my knowledge, hasn't been won in any other local context in the United States, which was control over what the $30 million cut was going to be used for through participatory budgeting processes. So residents can meet and decide, what do we think public safety means? What would we need for that? And how do we shift resources in that way? And that bypasses the presidents and the lobbyists and the mayors and the governors, and just gets people in the community to ask the question for themselves: what do we need, and what do we decide is important? And I think if we can do that everywhere with 100% of the police budget, then that's something that looks more like a way of responding to police violence. And that's something that looks like it would cut off the worst excesses of climate crisis at this institutional level.
Is there anything in your recent work on this topic? I know that you've written more than one article about policing. I saw one that was linked in the Dissent article. So is there any point of analysis that we haven't touched on yet that you think is key for the people listening to understand the broader analysis that your work is dedicated to?
I think the last thing that I would say on this that explains why I have this perspective on policing, but that explains, I think, more generally why I'm trying to push for things like energy democracy as a response to climate crisis. So community control over power, you could describe it as, right? And that kind of approach more generally is because we need to recognize the difference between power and influence, and our recognition of that difference needs to show up at the level of our political demands. So, it's one thing, and it's great work, and it's important work, and we should keep doing it to pressure the people who have decision-making power over the things that control our lives to make the kinds of decisions that are just, and to make better decisions than they've been making, and to make the ones we want them to make. But I think an even better goal would be to be the ones making the decisions in the first place, right? It's not written in stone anywhere that it has to be, effectively corporate lobbyists' job to decide how our community lives and how our individual lives are run. We actually don't have to make decisions that way, and we don't have to cede decision-making power to a decision-making body that they've bought. And the more we can push for not just good decisions, but decision-making power itself in a formally recognized way, backed with the resources that come out of our labor in the first place, I think the better position will be in politically to respond to things like climate crisis and every other problem that we have in ways that are positive for the people that live on this planet and the planet itself, rather than for a small cabal of colonial overlords.
On that point, you mentioned the participatory budgeting, which has been used. It's increasingly used across the world, although it's still a very small movement. I started in Porto Alegre, Brazil, I think, and the U.S. has some cities that do participatory budgeting. But beyond that, what other new mechanisms, new democratic mechanisms, do you propose? Because people might hear what you said a couple seconds ago and say, "Well, we have a democracy. Like what more do you want?" Then we go to vote for our municipal, state, and federal government. So, what are the additional mechanisms that could make our system more democratic than it currently is?
Yeah, let me just remark on that first bit for a second. It's not clear to me that we do have a democracy, right? And I don't mean the smug internet reply guy like, well, actually, republic is a little different from a democracy. That's not that's not what I'm saying. Although that's true, and matters a little bit. But even more importantly, and more to the point, what people want just is not the explanation for what the government does. What people need is not the explanation for what the government does. Throw out all the complications. Is that why we were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan? Really? Is that why? Is that why our grid looks like it does? Right? Is it because that's the way to protect people and make sure everyone has energy access? Is protection of the people or response to the people the reason why people didn't get their coronavirus checks? Right? The things that the government does are explained by complicated bids for power between competing forces of millionaires. That is the explanation for our government's behavior. And some people may be inclined to defend that kind of government. I'm not myself. But regardless of whether you think that's good or bad, what it isn't is a democracy, right? In no way, shape, or form is that a democracy, if you ask me. What would be a democracy is participatory budgeting. But to answer your question, what would also be a democracy would be other forms of governance that put real decision-making power in the hands of the people who are going to be affected by the policies and the decisions made. Other forms of that include a process called sortition, or the citizens' assembly. So that's an approach to legislating that picks people at random, kind of like the first stage of jury selection, if you're familiar with that. And puts to them a problem or a set of problems and gives them the resources to find experts to testify, say, here are the pros and cons, and then the people who have been selected for this body decide what is better. That's another decision-making process. Other people have endorsed things called lotocracy. You could have that same kind of random selection, but have someone randomly selected to serve as a legislator, right? So essentially, the whole Republican idea, Republican in the sense of republic, not the political party of that name, But the republic-related idea of having representatives, but chosen by lottery rather than by election, so you get rid of the ads and the money and those sorts of things. And, I'm sure that there are other things that I haven't thought of that other people have thought of. And, we should start to really vet some of these ideas. Which of them are going to work? Which of them aren't? And not just vet them theoretically. We should actually try them and see what works and what doesn't work. And, improve them based on what we learn. But until we start thinking of governance as something that's amenable to change and amenable to our direct participation in, as opposed to always thinking of politics in terms of pressure campaigns on the people who attain the levers of power, I think, we're going to be on the back footing.
Professor Táíwò, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you.